Whenever we fly out of gliding range of our home airfield, we run the risk of landing out. Whilst field landings obviously require greater caution and care than a landing at our home field, they should not be considered as dangerous or difficult. Like many things in gliding, the more we do, the easier it becomes. They are far less of a hurdle if they are first taught and practiced in a motor glider with a suitably qualified and experienced instructor.
Even this has its drawbacks, however, and a single session can at best only provide a snapshot of what fields are available in the immediate vicinity of the home airfield at any one time of the year.
To become competent at field landings, it is necessary to have looked at many fields in different areas and various seasons. This presentation sets out to do just that. It is based on the experience and knowledge of seasoned cross-country pilots who between them have landed in hundreds of fields. We will look at a variety of fields and where possible revisit those fields at different times of the year to see how they have changed with the seasons. Most of the fields looked at will be in the south of the UK, but the same principles apply wherever we fly. What will change with geographical location will be the average size of field available and the proportion of crop fields to grazing fields. As we change from mainly arable farming to largely stock farming, the fields tend to become smaller with pasture becoming more prevalent. Let's begin by looking at the process of field selection. We generally choose fields in the order of size, allied with colour and wind direction, which we'll look at later, then slope and finally surface. We do it in that order because from the height above the ground that we should start to closely consider the field landing, say 1,500 feet or so, we can clearly see the size and colour of a great many fields in the immediate area. You should be aware of the wind direction and should be able to pick up on clues that will give an indication of the surface wind. We cannot, however, easily discern the slope of the ground until we are closer to it. In other words, lower. Finally, we can begin to pick up the detail of the surface only when we get down to 1,000 feet or so. Along with surface detail and suitability, we can also check for likely obstructions that might get in our way and plan the circuit accordingly.
With practice, it is possible to speed up the process of selection, enabling a much quicker assessment and a more certain selection.
Let's look at some fields.
Here we see typical countryside in the south of England. This is the end of July. We will see later how things change with the season, but here we are interested only in the size of the available fields. Because it's midsummer, the dominant colours are yellow or green. Looking at the picture, there are various size fields in view. Some are quite large. From this height, we could glide to the fields about halfway to the horizon. Obviously, it depends on the wind and the glider and the amount of sink we encounter, but generally that's a good guess. We can see large green fields in the distance at the top of the picture, which we could easily reach, which look quite promising, and lots of others that are obviously crop of some description. We are at about 2,000 feet here, and whilst we are not desperate, we should be spending more and more of our attention on looking for possible fields, rather than trying to find lift. The lower we get, the more attention we should give to the field landing. At this height, we can afford to spend a little time getting into a good position to either climb away in good lift or examine suitable fields in the area. At the moment, we are simply looking at size, and if we look at the field in the middle foreground, disregarding the surface for the moment, we can see a collection of houses along the near edge. So, size and colour you can see from a distance, and it's a good idea to move towards likely looking fields that are the correct colour for the time of year while you still have the height to do so. A little closer to that field and we are down to about 1,500 feet. We can see houses running along one side. By looking at this feature, we can immediately gauge the size of that field and with it the scale of the field and the surrounding area. Using those houses as a scale, try superimposing your airfield on this picture. We could easily land a glider in that field, approaching from the top of the frame and landing towards the houses, assuming the wind allowed for such an approach. So, by taking a familiar feature, we can estimate the size of the fields around about. This is an important process because in an area where the fields are small, even a field of modest proportions would look enormous. We can see that our field does not look especially large. There are bigger fields around the area, but using our scale technique, we know it is more than adequate. Here we are in a different area at a different time of year. It's late spring and there are several fields of quite thick, dense crop. Some fields bright yellow with rape flowers, whilst others are pasture, and some with cattle grazing. The fields are much smaller than in the previous picture, but looking at the field highlighted and comparing it with the size of the houses and farm buildings, we can see it is indeed suitable for a landing as far as size is concerned, but it is considerably smaller than the field identified in the previous slide. Of course, we would have to look more closely at this field if we were considering an approach into it. For instance, if you look closely, you can identify some overhead wires running across the right of the field to the farm buildings. We will look at wires later, but as an example we might consider an approach landing from left to right as we look at this picture, assuming the wind was favourable. An additional consideration as far as size is concerned is that of obstacles on the approach. Approaching over a low fence or hedge, for instance, is not a problem, but replace that low boundary with a line of trees and it effectively reduces the available size of the field. In this field, for example, our field is effectively longer if we make an approach from left to right across the low fence than it would be if we approached over the trees. Making an approach over an obstacle will reduce the size of the field by up to 8 times the height of the obstacle. That's as steep as you can practically make an approach with air brake. Take a typical mature oak tree of say 100 foot. If we were to make an approach over this tree, the first 800 feet of our field would be unusable. We simply cannot descend the glider steeply enough to be able to use this part of the landing area. The field effectively becomes 800 feet shorter for our purposes. It is, of course, important to be aware of the wind direction throughout your flight. You will learn that knowing the wind direction will prove very useful when trying to assess where to look for lift relative to the ground when you get low, for instance. It will also dictate strategy on each leg of your task when the wind plays a significant factor. It is, of course, vital that you make a correct assessment of the wind strength and direction before a field landing. Many a potential easy field landing has turned into a disaster because the pilot did not properly assess the wind. When it comes to the actual landing, of course, we should approach into wind, if at all possible, or rather as much into wind as possible. A certain amount of crosswind is acceptable. The amount depends upon the wind strength and the available length of the field. An obvious way of effectively increasing the available landing distance is by choosing an approach such that we would land across the diagonal of the field, accepting less of a headwind. In strong winds this might prove tricky, but then, on these occasions, the wind is probably strong enough so as not to require this extra distance. There are usually many indications of the wind direction. In this picture we can clearly see smoke. It may be a factory chimney or power station or a fire somewhere. Usually we can see smoke somewhere during the flight, and that should be enough to update our perception of the wind direction. We might pick up the wind direction from the drift present whilst climbing in a thermal, or the cloud shadow movement across the ground. Remember, however, that anything that shows the wind at flying height, cloud shadow or thermal drift for example, will not show the true wind on the ground. Generally, the wind at the ground level can be 30 to 40 degrees back that's anti-clockwise from the wind at height, but it gives a good reference. We can also identify the wind direction and to a certain extent its strength from the ripples it makes in a corn crop, principally barley. We can see a distinct wave caused by the wind, and this is a very good indication of the direction on a strong wind day, but only of course if the crop is long and therefore only later in the season. So, if at all possible, we would plan to land into the winds. That way we can accept a slightly shorter field, or to put it another way, we effectively make the field longer by landing into the wind. As we said previously, a degree of crosswind is acceptable, but that depends on the size of the field and the wind strength and direction. In some circumstances, it may be necessary to accept a crosswind in order to give a better approach over obstructions. It's a question of degree. Before leaving the subject of size, it should be said that the biggest is not necessarily the best. We are not looking for the largest field around, we are looking for the most suitable, and one criteria is size, which must be adequate. But it need not be the biggest. In general, large fields tend to be used for crop production. It's more cost effective for the farmer to work one large field than several smaller ones. Consequently, when the crop has grown beyond a certain length, that field becomes unsuitable for landing until it is harvested. A available size can very much depend on the season. Let's now consider slope. In general, we cannot land down a slope. Even a gentle slope will add many hundreds of meters to our required landing distance. We can land up a slope with care, and faced with a field landing on sloping ground, it would be preferable to land uphill rather than downhill, even if this means we land downwind. But if all that is available is a sloping field, then you have started your field selection procedure too late, and you should have considered the field availability sooner in order to give greater choice. If a sloping field is inevitable, then you should approach to land up the slope, regardless of the wind direction. So, slope is very important, and we should spend some of the time we have available looking for and assessing any slope that is present in order to be able to reject the field or take that slope into account when planning a landing. Let's get back to trying to identify the slope. Any slope that is visible from 1,500 feet or so is unacceptable, and even steep slopes can be difficult to detect from overhead the field. To see a slope, we have to view the field from the side, and ideally two sides. Looking at the picture, we are considering the fields in the centre of the view. It's tilled with no crop showing at the moment, but disregarding its surface, if we simply fly overhead or very close to the field, as we are now, it looks reasonably flat. We are planning to land from the top of the picture towards the bottom, and at the moment that looks okay. But before we make an approach, we're going to fly around the field, maintaining enough distance from it to enable us to view the field at an angle. As we approach the end of our leg, we will look back to see the field from a different angle. And now we can see quite clearly that the field is sloping, and that slope is downhill in our intended landing direction. There is another clue to slope in this picture we can see, and that is the change in surface colour. Across the middle of the field and running into the adjacent field. It's there due to the runoff of groundwater, which leaves a different surface contrast. This colour change adds a perspective to the field that suggests a slope. It's not always there, but when it is, it's helpful. It should at least make you suspicious that there is some slope to the field. There are some other indicators of slope we can look at that should give us a clue as to what the slope might be. The wriggling line is a stream, and that would suggest that the fields in this picture will slope down towards the stream. Not by very much in this picture, but you get the idea. Nature always makes wriggling lines. A straight line is man-made. A wriggling line is generally a stream. Even if you can't see the water as in this scene, a wriggling line of bushes should suggest a stream, and that might help to determine slope.
Let's recap. Any slope must be identified before it's too late to take it into account, or the field is rejected. If you can identify a slope from the air, it is too steep to land down. You cannot identify slope from overhead. If you have to land on slope, land uphill, even if this means downwind. An uphill landing will require a substantial increase in your approach speed, much higher than for a landing on a level field. During the round out, there is a much larger angle through which the nose must be rotated. Effectively, you're attempting to fly uphill until touchdown, and that requires a lot of extra energy. As a rough guide, you should add around 10 knots for every degree of upslope. Of course, slope is not easy to quantify, so adding a good healthy 15 or 20 knots to your normal approach speed is not excessive. You will very quickly burn off this extra energy during round out and subsequent very short ground roll. Oh, and don't leave your round out too late. Remember, there is a greater angle through which to rotate, and that will take an extra couple of seconds to achieve. So approach faster and round out earlier. So, we've looked at size, then slope. It's time now to look at surface. More precisely, what is growing in the field we are considering, and can it accommodate our landing in it? A flat field that is large enough to land a glider is a valuable asset for the farmer, and he's going to try and make as much use of it as possible. It's almost always going to be used for something. Because it is more cost effective to work a large field, the biggest fields are used for crop production. This means at some times of the year the biggest fields cannot be used. Here we see the situation in early spring. We can see that almost all of the fields have something growing in them. Mostly the colour is green, but looking a little closer we can identify numerous shades of green. There are a few brown colours, but even these have a green tinge which suggests a very young crop just showing through. A crop may be either winter or spring sown. The term winter implies that the crop was sown in the previous autumn and has lain dormant over the winter, ready to grow as soon as the combination of sunshine, temperature and day length produce the right conditions for growth. This will obviously vary depending exact location in the country and may produce variations of 2 to 3 weeks depending on how far north we are. A winter sown crop will therefore be more advanced in its growing cycle than a spring sown crop, and as such will produce a higher yield than its spring sown cousin, although generally of a poorer quality. Looking at our fields again, we might assume that the dark green field to the top right may be a winter sown wheat crop, while the lighter coloured field next door may well be a spring sown, probably a barley crop which will be less dense than a field of wheat. Looking closer, we can see that the surface is cultivated. It has been worked and rolled prior to sowing, leaving the surface smooth and flat, and the crop is still quite small. We can get away with a landing in a crop field early in the season. All crops will be short, and providing we keep our wings level as we land, it should be possible to land safely. At this time of year, crops have a lot more growing left to do, and whilst a landing glider will do some damage, it will grow out very quickly and as such will not affect the final crop. But because the individual plants are small, they have very little root structure. If there has been recent rain, the ground may be quite soft, in which case you should be prepared for a very short ground roll. As a general rule, if you can see earth through the crop, it should be okay for a landing. A good clue are the tram lines, or tractor wheelings, the parallel lines up and down the field. If they are dark and definite, the crop is too tall. If they are showing earth through them, then it may be suitable. If you can see earth showing through the crop away from the tram lines, then the crop is almost certainly suitable for a landing with care. Let's take a closer look at tractor wheelings. We can see the wheelings clearly in this picture.
all taken around the end of April.
To do the least amount of damage to a crop, and to more precisely spray expensive fertilizers and pesticides, the farmer will use the same track over and over again, and these parallel lines in the field will be visible throughout the season in all the crops.
The tractor will make shallow ruts if the surface is dry, but in a wet spring these ruts may get very deep as machinery goes down the same track a few times. The wheelings will stay for the whole of the season, and so will the ruts, and as the ground dries during the summer, these ruts can be baked hard. It is always a good idea to land along the wheelings parallel to them, and avoid landing across them. Some may be very deep, and deep enough to damage your glider.
Farm machinery tends not to work well across slope, so wheelings usually run up and down any significant incline, another possible clue to a sloping field.
We can see now the wheelings how they look from the ground. This is a wheat field in May, although a very dense crop and much too thick for a successful landing. This is after a dry spring and the wheelings are quite shallow.
And this is a barley field in June after a particularly wet spring. This is about a foot deep. And some similar fields from the air. The wheelings are very obvious, both in the dark wheat fields and the much lighter coloured barley crop to the right of the frame. Obviously, if we see the field at this stage of development of the crop, we would not choose to land in them. Before moving on then, let's take a look at another springtime crop, oilseed rape. By late March, which is when this picture was taken, oilseed rape is already too tall for a safe planned landing. Planted in the previous autumn and harvested in July, oilseed rape does not grow quickly until around early April. It then begins to grow very rapidly from about mid-April onwards and can put on 8 to 10 centimetres per day at its peak. By the time we start to get interested in fields, late March or so, the crop is already some 5 centimetres tall and looks like tall cabbages. Although the surface is smooth and flat under the crop, because fertiliser is added in February when the ground is soft and wet, the tractor wheelings will be deep and dangerous. These will stay in the field once formed, all the way through past the harvest. Around mid-April, the crop will form distinctive yellow flowers, which will be visible for miles around. These vivid mustard yellow petals will stay around until early June, when the flowers begin to fade and drop, leaving a tangled, matted mess of light green foliage on a stalk that stands some 1.8 metres tall. We'll leave oilseed rape there for the time being and come back to it later in the season. It is very recognisable when in flower, not so when they drop, but the tractor wheelings remain, and so it is still distinguishable. At any time during the soaring calendar, an oilseed rape field is not suitable for landing. Even after harvesting, we need to exercise caution because of the depth of its tractor wheelings. Tractor wheelings will be visible in every crop field. Their presence will identify the field as being one of crop and will give a very good indication in springtime as to its depth. If there are no wheelings, then it's not a cereal crop field you are looking at. It is probably a grass field. By the time we get to the end of June, landable fields are few and far between. Most crops have essentially finished their growth stage. They are as tall as they are going to get, and from now on they will gradually change colour. They are way too high for a successful landing, and because most fields are still various shades of green, grass fields are hard to pick out. Some of the winter sown cereals may very well be beginning to ripen and to change shade. But notice that the crop fields are still clearly showing tractor wheelings. A grass field may be used for either grazing of stock or for the production of silage or hay, which will be used through the winter months as feed. If it's a pasture field, it will not have any pattern to the surface. If it's used to produce feed, it may have faint wheelings at certain times of the year. See if you can pick out the grass field in this picture.
In most areas of the country, but especially in areas where cattle are reared, you will certainly find fields of grass being grown to produce silage or hay. Grass for silage is allowed to grow thick and lush and is cut when it is still green and growing. The first cut is made during May when the grass stands about 60 centimetres. This produces the biggest yield for the farmer. A further 1 or 2 harvests may be taken later in the season. It is an important crop for the stock farmer and will feed his cattle over the winter. A silage field may be treated with fertiliser to increase the yield, and this is when it may resemble a cereal field as the machinery leaves behind wheelings in the field. After it has been cut, the silage will lay in swathes in the field until it is gathered up and either loaded into a trailer for transportation to a storage area on the farm or rolled into large round bales and wrapped in plastic for collection later. The surface that is left behind stands out as a perfect landing area. Hay is cut in late June when the grass has stopped growing and begun to dry. It may also be cut in early August. It is again cut and swathed, but now it is left to dry. Hay can only be made during fine weather for this reason. If it gets wet, it is of poor quality and unpalatable. It will be turned when in the field to promote drying, and once it is ready, will be baled or rolled and taken away for storage for the winter months. So, back to our earlier picture, the grass fields in the centre of the frame. Because this is late June, we can say it's a hayfield that's been cut and is drying in swathes ready for collection. It resembles a crop field because of the parallel lines, but these are too close together to be tractor wheelings. The colour is that of a ripening crop, but it is too early in the season for the cereals to be this colour. Compare with fields around and you can see they have only just begun to change. They are still mostly green. So, by deduction, we can determine the surface. It would be unwise to land in a silage or hayfield such that you are landing in swathes. They are deep and will cause a ground loop if you catch a wing. Also, the farmer will not be very pleased with your arrival, especially if you delay his harvest. Landing alongside in the smooth stems that are left is not going to cause you or the farmer any problems. While we're on the subject of grass fields, we need to take a look at pasture fields and stock, and, inevitably, stock fences. Horses, sheep, cattle. Let's look at horses first. Horses, especially those bred for racing, are hugely expensive, easily spooked, and become stressed very easily. A typical stud farm is neat and tidy with a regular rectangular layout. The paddocks are generally small and separated with definite, well-defined fences, usually painted white. We can easily land in any of the large fields in the centre of the picture, but we can also see the field bottom right has horses in it. Landing in any of the adjacent fields may well cause those horses to panic. They can be very highly strung creatures, and you landing close by could be enough of a fright to cause them to bolt. They can end up hurting themselves in their panic, and worse still, if there is a mare in foal at the time, your third-party insurance will probably not cover the miscarriage of a prize racing horse. Associated with the training of racehorses are the gallops used for exercise. These are usually close by the main farm and can be excellent landing areas. They are generally clear of any obstructions on the ground and should be clear from anything that might endanger your aircraft. Of course, if there is any sign of the gallops being used by horses, they must be avoided. What about sheep? If we zoom in on the field to the lower left, regardless of the fact it's next to a stud farm, we can see that in this state it is not possible to land in. Sheep tend to spread themselves out when grazing to the extent that they will occupy the whole field. Like horses, sheep are very easily panicked and will tend to gather in a single flock, but in doing so we'll race around the field trying to find the biggest group. A field of sheep like this is not a suitable landing area. And so to cattle, and in particular dairy farming. Here we can see a collection of green fields. Most are pasture fields. The field in the immediate foreground is a crop of maize. It's mid-July and you would of course expect any cereal crops to be ripened and in the process of harvesting by now. The fact that this one is green in July is, from a distance, an obvious sign. A closer look at it and it becomes obvious by the texture that it is not a grass field, and significantly notice no tractor wheelings. Cows are by nature extremely curious animals. They will want to investigate and taste anything new in their field and can destroy a glider in minutes if allowed near it. Avoid landing in a field of cows unless there's absolutely nothing else available. If you do land, or vache, as the French say, be prepared to be set upon by the entire herd in a matter of minutes. They are interested in your glider, not you, and you will have to be quick and athletic to prevent them getting close enough to do damage. Do not leave your glider. If you do, when you return, it will be destroyed. Apart from the beasts themselves, there is the additional problem of cattle fencing. The grass fields we can see in the middle of the picture are divided by fences, and whilst we can discern where some of those fences are, others are not so obvious. If the fence is separating two empty pasture fields, and those fields have not had stock in them for some time, or in other words, they haven't been grazed recently, then the difference is even less obvious. Same collection of fields, and here we can see that the field adjacent to the farm buildings has grazing cattle in part of it. They are prevented from grazing the majority of the field by a fence, but in this picture we cannot actually see the fence. It may be an electric fence which the farmer will move in order to strip graze the field. This particular fence, and the fences in all of the other fields in this picture, are in fact permanent fences, but we cannot see them. What we can see, however, is a distinct colour change that may suggest the presence of a fence. Let's change position a little. Looking at the fields at the bottom of the picture, we can see an obvious change in colour. We can't see a fence, but we can imagine a fence being there. Looking at the fields on the other side of the dirt track, we can see that there are distinct divisions shown by obvious changes in colour where either permanent or electric fences lie. These fences will not only be used to prevent stock grazing new ground, but will also be used to prevent them disturbing previously grazed pasture, to enable it to regrow. It is these changes in colour which give away the possible presence of a fence, and which should make you very cautious. The colour change may be very slight, but any change in colour should be treated with caution and requires further investigation and examination for the presence of a fence of some description. Look at the area of ground between the road and the track. There is something there, but it is far from obvious. But we should start to think fence because of that subtle change. If we get a little closer still and fly around the area, we are down to about 1,000 feet now, and we can see the colour changes across the areas to the right of the track. They are becoming obvious, and those changes in colour are telling you that there is something there. If we were considering this area of fields for a landing, then we would be looking very carefully at these colour changes and how they divide the area up. We can see that to the right of the dirt track, the colour changes are making individual fields that are too small to be of use. Between the dirt track and the road, however, it looks more promising, and assuming the wind was favourable, we might be considering a landing parallel to the road, towards the buildings in the top left of the picture. Nothing we have seen in the previous pictures would suggest that this is not a good plan. We will continue to fly around these fields and look at them from different angles. Remember, we are looking at the area between the road and the track, and there is detail beginning to become obvious. We'll highlight it for you. There is something there. And here, very difficult to see at the moment, but definitely something there. Let's continue round. Now we can see definite and distinct colour changes in the area we were considering. there are lighter patches of colour showing the lines of possible fences, making that area of poor choice. But we only discover this by careful examination and flying around several sides of the field. Let's go down to ground level. The fence is actually in the previous picture. It is the kind that divides all of these fields in this series of pictures. But up until the last couple of slides, it was invisible. We were suspicious that there may have been a fence in the later slides because of the colour change, but the fence itself was not visible, and that fence could be lethal if you tried to land through it. Let's go back to 1,500 feet or so. So we have a slight colour change which makes us suspicious of a fence. That colour change should be enough for us to decide to land along the parent colour change rather than through it. Or, as in this case, choose another field entirely. Even when you know the fence is there, it's still difficult to identify. There may be other indicators that help us identify the presence of a fence. Let's zoom in into a couple on this slide. We can see several areas where the grass has been worn away. Here, for instance, at the entrance to the field where the stock gather and are led away, we can see a definite worn path, which is usually associated with a gate, and which is normally in the corner of a field, that corner being made up of two fences. This is a solid indicator that we are indeed looking at a grass pasture field and a good clue to the presence of a fence. Another clue, along with the colour change, is the presence of drinking troughs, seen here. These troughs are sometimes placed in fences so that the cattle or sheep can drink from either side. Look closely along the colour change and you may be able to spot the drinking troughs. Here we can see such troughs with a fence, or at least a colour change running through them. Water troughs can mean a fence. At least assume there is a fence running between them, and that fence can be invisible until you are too close to it. So resolve to land along a colour change, not across it. If there is a fence, you will avoid it. The simple message about livestock is avoid landing in a field that is already occupied. You will save yourself a great deal of trouble. There are other obstructions we need to consider very carefully when selecting our field, and those are power wires or telegraph wires. These are power wires. They tend to run straight across a field, taking the most direct route. They generally have 3 wires and sometimes, as here, have a spur off in another direction. They can be tricky to see from the air, and many times it's not the poles that are the first thing that you spot. The farmer can't always get in close to the poles with spraying or sowing machinery, and quite often there is a bare patch around the base or a circular pattern around the poles. Of course, knowing where the wires are in a crop field, if we are not going to land in it, is of little use unless, if we can pick out the lines of the poles, we can sometimes work out how they may affect the field we are interested in, because power wires can be very difficult to spot in a grass field. Remember, it's not the wires you're going to see until the very last minute. It's the poles or evidence of the poles. If you can see a line of poles, you can avoid the wires. If you can't see the poles, you won't see the wires. Sometimes power wires or telephone wires are supported by poles which are hidden in hedgerows or trees. It's common for wires to run along the sides of the roads, especially telephone wires. If you are approaching over a road, assume there are telephone poles. Even if you can't see them, assume that they are there. If you attempt to approach through a gap in the trees or bushes, or low over a road boundary, there is a real danger in the wires that you cannot see. Flying under them at the last minute is not an option. Flying through them can be fatal. Around the end of May, beginning of June, the crops have really finished their growth stage. They are as tall as they are going to get, and from now on they will gradually change colour. Barley will start to turn a lighter shade of green as it gradually ripens. We have to be careful as some strains of barley can look a lot like newly cut grass from certain angles and from a distance. As we get closer, however, and fly around the field, we can notice the tractor wheelings, and they always point toward it being a crop field. Wheat will become initially dark green in colour as it grows its last flag leaf and then the head. It will begin to turn a lighter green and then ripen a little later than barley. As the season progresses, the fields become uniform in colour with distinct tractor wheelings. Some fields may show storm damage where powerful gusts have flattened the crop. At this time of year, June into July, when crop is too long before the harvest, suitable landing fields can be hard to find. We are mainly focusing on grass and pasture fields and, depending on where you are, these can be tricky to spot. It pays to start looking earlier and higher. By late July, early August, depending on where you are and what the weather has been like, cereal crops are ready for harvest. They have turned into a golden colour and are relatively dry. It is important that the crop is dry when it is cut, so in fine weather the combines will be working dawn to dusk and beyond to gather in the crop. The combine does several things at once. It cuts the stalk, separates the head and the thrashers, separating the grain from the chaff. The grain is unloaded at intervals by a trailer driving alongside, which will take its load to the grain store for drying and storage. The straw is thrown out of the back of the combine and lays in swathes along its track. This is then gathered by a baling machine, which will either bale or roll the straw, which will later be used in the year for winter bedding for cattle or pigs, as well as being used as a feed. In eastern areas where there are less livestock and more arable areas, there is an excess of straw. If it is not required by the farmer, he may choose to simply chop it into a mulch as it leaves the combine and spread it on the field ready to be ploughed in to increase the soil's organic content. The surface that is left is smooth and firm and is perfect for landing. Although the cut field is of a similar colour to uncut fields, the difference should be obvious enough to tell them apart, even at a distance. The real clue is in the texture. Gone are the regular tram lines and the even consistency of the surface. The field looks somehow scruffy and untidy. Look at the random tracks formed by the tractors and trailers as they take the shortest distance between the working combine and the gate. So, although in certain light and at a certain angle a field that has been harvested can look similar to a field of standing corn, we can guarantee that if we see random tracks across the field, it has been harvested. Here we are looking at a crop field and, assuming any bales have been gathered and other factors are favourable, it is ideal for landing. Here we can see a stubble field. The bottom half of the field has straw lines. The top half has bales, and we see the baling machine working the straw lines. The random track across the ridges tells us what they are. Obviously, it would be unwise to attempt a landing between the bales. We could, if we had to, however, land in the straw lines, if we were careful. Landing across them is not a good idea. They can be very deep, and lines like this, for instance, would certainly tear your undercarriage doors off, at the very least. But if we land along the lines, between the ridges, so long as we keep the wings level, we should be okay. Dipping the wing into a line of straw, however, could ground loop the glider. In fact, whenever we are landing in a stubble field, we should always try to land along the lines of cut if at all possible. This is the direction the field has been worked. It has been ploughed and tilled and sown and fertilised in the same direction, and all the ruts and tractor tracks will be parallel. If we try and land across the direction of cut, we should expect a very rough and bumpy arrival, maybe enough to damage our glider. Usually, very soon after the crop is gathered and the straw has been picked up, the land will be cultivated. A disc cultivator cuts up the surface and incorporates the stubble. It leaves a soft surface which is still okay for landing providing it hasn't rained. Alternatively, a plough is used, sometimes with a press, to consolidate the ground. Either way, this usually breaks up too much of the previous crop's root structure, and the surface becomes too rough and soft for a successful landing. So, we have been through the whole of the sowing season, from spring through to autumn, and we've looked at the way things change as the farming year progresses. Successful field landings is a prerequisite of cross-country gliding. Knowing what is available and when is a great help, as is a working knowledge of the farming countryside. If you spare a thought to the condition of the fields every time you fly and get used to looking at them and assessing them, your ability and confidence in choosing suitable fields will grow, and the prospect of landing out will no longer hold any fear or trepidation. There have been many articles written and published in sailplane and gliding about the subject, and it would be a good idea to review these when you can. There are also some important considerations about codes of conduct and the legal aspect of landing uninvited on somebody else's property available on the British Gliding website. It's important you know your rights as well as understand the landowner's point of view. Safe flying and happy landings.